The air was heavy with grief, the kind that clings to your chest and makes every breath feel like a struggle. The cemetery was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant chirping of birds. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the living came to remember the dead. And there she was, Eleanor, the widow dressed in black, standing over her husband's grave. Her fingers trembled as they traced the letters carved into the cold stone, James Carter, beloved husband and father. It had been 6 months since the accident, 6 months since her world had shattered into a million pieces. But today, something was different. Today, she wasn't alone. Eleanor's eyes flickered to the figure standing a few feet away, a young woman, no older than 25, with dark skin and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. She was dressed simply, in a plain gray coat, her hands clutching a single white rose. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Who was she? And why was she here, at James's grave? The questions swirled in her mind, but before she could muster the courage to speak, the young woman turned and met her gaze. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was something in those eyes, something familiar, something that made Eleanor's stomach twist in a way she couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," the young woman said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to intrude." She took a step closer, her eyes darting to the grave and then back to Eleanor. I needed to see him. To say goodbye." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Goodbye, what did that mean? Who was this woman, and what connection did she have to James? The questions burned in her mind, but before she could ask, the young woman placed the white rose on the grave and turned to leave. "Wait!" Eleanor called out, her voice trembling. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The young woman paused, her back still turned. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Eleanor wondered if she would even respond. But then, slowly, she turned around, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "My name is Amara," she said quietly. "And James, he was my father." The words hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. Her knees buckled, and she had to steady herself against the gravestone. Her father, that couldn't be. James had never mentioned a daughter. He had never mentioned her, but as Eleanor looked into Amara's eyes, she saw it, the same shape, the same intensity. It was like looking at a younger version of James. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about her husband, about their life together, began to unravel. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "James never told me about you." "He never said." Her words trailed off as Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She handed it to Eleanor, who took it with trembling hands. The photo was old, the edges frayed, but the image was clear, a younger James, smiling brightly, with his arm around a woman Eleanor didn't recognize. And there, sitting on the woman's lap, was a little girl, Amara. Eleanor's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Amara hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "That's my mother," she said finally. "And James, he was my father. But he left us when I was just a baby. I never knew him, not really. Not until," she paused, her voice cracking. "Not until I found out he was gone." Eleanor's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. James had a daughter. A family. A life before her. And he had never said a word. Why? What else had he kept from her? The questions burned in her mind, but before she could ask, Amara spoke again. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something you need to know." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for Amara to continue. But the young woman hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "What else is there?" Amara took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what came next. "It's about the accident," she said slowly. It wasn't an accident. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not an accident, what did that mean? What was Amara trying to say? But before she could ask, Amara turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing there, clutching the photograph, her mind spinning with questions she didn't have the answers to. As she watched Amara disappear into the distance, Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The truth was out there, just beyond her reach, and she knew she couldn't rest until she found it. But what would she discover? And how far was she willing to go to uncover the secrets James had taken to his grave? The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver through her body. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its voice echoing through the empty cemetery. Eleanor looked down at the photograph in her hands, her heart heavy with a mix of grief and betrayal. This was just the beginning. And she had no idea what was coming next. Eleanor stood frozen in the cemetery, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hands. The wind whipped around her, tugging at the edges of her coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, replaying Amara's words over and over again. It wasn't an accident, what did that mean? And why had James never told her about Amara or her mother? The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved, built a life with, suddenly felt like a stranger. She needed answers, but where could she even begin? The drive home was a blur. Eleanor barely remembered getting into her car or navigating the familiar streets. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as her thoughts spiraled. When she finally pulled into the driveway of the house she had shared with James, it felt emptier than ever. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, she realized how much she had been clinging to the memories of him to fill the void. But now, those memories felt tainted, like a beautiful painting with a hidden crack running through it. She stepped inside, the photograph still in her hand, and made her way to the living room. The walls were lined with pictures of their life together, smiling faces, vacations, birthdays. James had always been the one to insist on taking photos, capturing every moment. Now, Eleanor wondered if it was his way of trying to hold on to something, or perhaps to cover up what he had left behind. She sank into the couch, staring at the old photo Amara had given her. The woman in the picture was beautiful, with warm eyes and a gentle smile. And the little girl, Amara, looked so much like James. How could he have walked away from them? How could he have kept this secret for so long? Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the coffee table. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen, Detective Harris. He had been the one to handle James's case after the accident. She hadn't spoken to him in months, not since the investigation had been closed. Why was he calling now? She hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello. Mrs. Carter, Detective Harris's voice was calm but serious. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to check in and see how you're holding up. Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him about Amara, about the photograph, about the doubts that were now consuming her. But something held her back. I'm managing, she said finally, her voice barely steady. Is there something you need? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Eleanor could almost hear the detective choosing his words carefully. Actually, yes, he said. There's something I'd like to discuss with you. It's about your husband's case. Would you be able to come down to the station tomorrow? Eleanor's heart raced. What could he possibly want to discuss now? The case had been closed months ago, ruled as a tragic accident. But after what Amara had said, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Of course, she said quickly. I'll be there. After hanging up, Eleanor sat in silence for a long time, her mind spinning. She thought about James, about the life they had built together. He had always been so kind, so loving. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been a facade. Had he been hiding this other life from her? And if so, what else didn't she know? She thought about Amara, about the pain in her eyes when she spoke about James. There was so much she wanted to ask her, so much she needed to understand. But Amara was gone, and Eleanor had no way of finding her. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the police station early, her nerves on edge. Detective Harris greeted her with a sympathetic smile and led her to a small, dimly lit room. "Thank you for coming," he said as they sat down. "I know this must be difficult for you." Eleanor nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Detective Harris leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Carter. There were always a few things about your husband's case that didn't sit right with me. At the time, there wasn't enough evidence to pursue it further, but recently, some new information has come to light." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. "What kind of information?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "We received an anonymous tip a few days ago," he said finally. "It suggested that your husband's death might not have been an accident after all. That there may have been foul play involved." Eleanor felt like the room was spinning. Foul play? Someone had hurt James. But who? And why? Her mind raced, but before she could ask any questions, Detective Harris continued. "We're reopening the case, and I wanted to let you know before things move forward. I know this is a lot to take in, but if there's anything you can think of, anything at all, that might help us, now is the time to share it." Eleanor's mind flashed back to Amara, to the photograph, to the words she had spoken at the cemetery. It wasn't an accident, could this be connected? She wanted to tell the detective everything, but something held her back. She needed to understand more before she could trust anyone with what she knew. I don't know," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I'll think about it and let you know if anything comes to mind." As she left the station, Eleanor felt more lost than ever. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they didn't fit together. James had a daughter he never told her about. His death might not have been an accident. And now, someone out there knew something, something they weren't willing to reveal openly. She needed to find Amara. She needed to know the truth. But where could she even start? Amara had disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, leaving no trace behind. Eleanor thought about the photograph, about the woman in it, Amara's mother. If she could find her, maybe she could get some answers. But how? She didn't even know her name. As she drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. She thought about James's old belongings, the boxes she had packed away after his death. Maybe there was something there, some clue she had overlooked. When she got home, she went straight to the attic, where she had stored James's things. The boxes were dusty, untouched since she had placed them there months ago. She opened the first one, her hands trembling as she sifted through old clothes, books, and papers. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she hoped she would know it when she found it. And then, at the bottom of the box, she saw it, a small, leather-bound journal. She had never seen it before. James had always been private, but he had never mentioned keeping a journal. Her heart raced as she opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. The handwriting was his, unmistakable. And the first sentence made her blood run cold. Asterisk, I never thought it would come to this, but I have no choice. If anything happens to me, it's because of her. Asterisk. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the journal, her eyes glued to the words James had written. Asterisk, if anything happens to me, it's because of her. Asterisk, who was her? Amara's mother? Someone else entirely? Her mind raced as she flipped through the pages, scanning the entries for clues. The journal was filled with James's thoughts, his fears, and his regrets. It was like hearing his voice again, but this time, it was laced with a darkness she had never seen in him before. He wrote about secrets, about mistakes he couldn't undo, and about a woman who had haunted him for years. But he never named her. It was always just her. Eleanor's heart ached as she read. She had always thought she knew James better than anyone, but now, it was clear there had been a side of him she had never seen. A side he had kept hidden, even from her. She flipped to the last entry, dated just a week before his death. The handwriting was messier, more frantic, as if he had been in a hurry. I can't keep running. She's found me. I don't know what she'll do, but I can't let her hurt Eleanor. I have to end this, once and for all. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. James had been afraid, not for himself, but for her. But who was he so afraid of? And what had he been trying to end? She closed the journal, her mind spinning. She needed to find Amara. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. But how? She had no last name, no address, nothing to go on. Then she remembered the photograph. She pulled it out of her pocket and studied it again. The woman in the picture, Amara's mother, had to be the key. If she could find her, maybe she could find Amara. But where to start? She thought about James's old friends, his co-workers, anyone who might have known him before they met. Maybe someone could help her piece together the past he had kept hidden. The next morning, Eleanor reached out to Mark, James's best friend since college. They hadn't spoken much since the funeral, but Mark had always been kind to her. When she called, he sounded surprised to hear from her but agreed to meet for coffee later that day. As she sat across from him in the small cafe, she could see the concern in his eyes. "How have you been holding up, Eleanor?" he asked gently. She forced a smile, though her hands were shaking under the table. "I've been better," she admitted. "There's something I need to ask you, Mark. Did James ever mention a woman from his past? Someone named? I don't know, someone he might have been involved with before me?" Mark's expression shifted, and for a moment, he looked uncomfortable. He glanced down at his coffee, stirring it slowly. "James didn't talk much about his past," he said carefully. "But there was one woman. Her name was Lydia. They were together for a while, back in their 20s. It was complicated." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Lydia," she repeated. "Do you know her last name? Or where she might be now?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I don't. James never talked about her much, and after they broke up, he cut her out of his life completely." "Why are you asking about this?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I found something," she said finally. "A journal. James wrote about someone he was afraid of, someone he thought might hurt him, or me. I think it might be her." Mark's eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Eleanor, if this is true, you need to be careful. James was a good man, but he had his demons. If Lydia's involved, she's not someone to take lightly." His words sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Lydia was intense. She didn't take the breakup well. There were rumors, back then, that she was unstable. James was scared of her, Eleanor. I think that's why he never talked about her. He just wanted to forget she existed." Eleanor's mind raced. If Lydia was as dangerous as Mark made her sound, what did that mean for Amara? Was she in danger too? And what about James's death? If Lydia was involved, had she been the one to cause the accident? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers, only more mysteries. As she left the cafe, Eleanor felt more determined than ever. She needed to find Lydia. She needed to know the truth. But how? She thought about the journal again, about the clues James might have left behind. Maybe there was something she had missed. When she got home, she went straight to the attic and began going through the boxes again, this time more carefully. She found old receipts, letters, and even a few photos she had never seen before. And then, tucked inside an old book, she found a folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a letter, addressed to James, written in a delicate, feminine handwriting. James, I know you're trying to forget me, but you can't. You owe me. You owe us. You think you can just walk away and start a new life, but I won't let you. You'll regret this. You'll regret everything. The letter wasn't signed, but Eleanor didn't need a name to know who had written it. It had to be Lydia. The words were filled with anger, with pain, with a threat that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. She folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. If Lydia had been this angry, this determined, what had she been capable of? And what had she done to James? Eleanor knew she was getting closer to the truth, but it felt like every answer only led to more questions. She needed to find Amara. She needed to find Lydia. But most of all, she needed to understand what had really happened to James. As she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of his life, she felt a strange mix of grief and determination. She had loved James with all her heart, but now, she wasn't sure she had ever really known him. And until she did, she couldn't let this go. The truth was out there, waiting for her. And she was going to find it, no matter what it took. Eleanor sat in the dimly lit attic, the letter from Lydia clutched tightly in her hands. The words seemed to burn into her skin, each sentence a reminder of the storm that had been brewing in James's life, a storm she had been completely unaware of. She felt a mix of anger and sorrow, but above all, a relentless determination to uncover the truth. She couldn't let James's death remain a mystery, not when it seemed like so much had been hidden from her. She needed to find Lydia. And she needed to find Amara. The next morning, Eleanor decided to visit James's old workplace. He had worked at a small engineering firm for years before they met, and she wondered if anyone there might remember Lydia or know something about her. When she arrived, the office was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to move slowly. She introduced herself to the receptionist, who recognized her name immediately. Mrs. Carter, the woman said softly, her eyes filled with sympathy. I'm so sorry for your loss. James was a good man. Eleanor forced a smile, though her heart ached at the words. Thank you, she said. I was wondering if I could speak to someone who worked with him. Maybe someone who knew him before we met. The receptionist nodded and led her to a small conference room. A few minutes later, an older man with graying hair walked in. He introduced himself as Carl, James's former supervisor. James was one of the best, Carl said, his voice tinged with sadness. What can I do for you, Mrs. Carter? Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. I'm trying to find someone James knew a long time ago. Her name is Lydia. Do you remember her? Carl's expression changed immediately. He looked uneasy, almost nervous. Lydia, he repeated, his voice low. Why are you asking about her? Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I found some things after James passed, she said carefully. Letters, a journal. It seems like she was important to him. I just need to understand. Carl sighed, running a hand over his face. Lydia was James's ex-girlfriend, he said finally. They were together for a few years, but it wasn't a healthy relationship. She was possessive. When they broke up, she didn't take it well. James was scared of her, Eleanor. He changed jobs, moved away, did everything he could to start over. I thought he'd left all that behind. Eleanor's heart pounded. Do you know where she is now? She asked, her voice trembling. Carl shook his head. I haven't heard anything about her in years. But if she's back in James's life, or was, before he died, you need to be careful. She's not someone to mess with. His words sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. She thanked him and left the office, her mind racing. If Lydia was as dangerous as everyone said, what did that mean for Amara? Was she in danger too? And what had really happened to James? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers, only more mysteries. That evening, Eleanor decided to go through James's phone records. She had kept his old phone, unable to bring herself to get rid of it. When she turned it on, she was surprised to see a string of missed calls from an unknown number in the weeks leading up to his death. The calls had come at all hours, sometimes multiple times a day. Eleanor's hands shook as she stared at the screen. Could this be Lydia? She dialed the number, her heart pounding as she waited. It rang once, twice, and then a woman's voice answered. Hello. The voice was cold, almost mocking. Eleanor froze, unsure what to say. Who is this? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then the woman laughed, a low, bitter sound that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. You don't know who I am, she said. But you've been looking for me, haven't you, Eleanor? The line went dead before Eleanor could respond. She sat there, stunned, her heart racing. It had to be Lydia. She had found her, or rather, Lydia had found her. But what did she want? And why had she been calling James? The questions burned in her mind, but there were no answers, only more fear. The next day, Eleanor received a package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of James, taken from a distance, as if he hadn't known he was being watched. On the back, someone had written in bold, angry letters, asterisk, you should have left well enough alone. Asterisk. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Lydia knew she was looking for her. And she wasn't happy about it. Eleanor knew she was in over her head. She needed help, but who could she trust? Detective Harris had reopened James's case, but she wasn't sure how much he could, or would, do to protect her. She thought about Amara, about the pain in her eyes when she spoke about James. If Lydia was as dangerous as everyone said, Amara might be in danger too. Eleanor needed to find her, to warn her. But how? She had no way of contacting her, no way of knowing where she might be. That night, Eleanor had a dream. She was standing in the cemetery again, staring at James's grave. But this time, Amara was there too, her eyes filled with tears. You have to stop her, Amara whispered. Before it's too late. Eleanor woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. She didn't know what the dream meant, but it felt like a warning. Time was running out. She needed to find Lydia. She needed to end this. But how? The next morning, Eleanor decided to visit the cemetery again. She didn't know why, but something drew her there. When she arrived, she saw a figure standing by James's grave. It was Amara. Eleanor's heart leapt, and she hurried over. Amara, she called out, her voice trembling. The young woman turned, her eyes wide with surprise, and fear. You shouldn't be here, Amara said quickly. It's not safe. Eleanor reached out, grabbing her arm. Please, she begged. I need to know the truth. What happened to James? Who is Lydia? And why is she after us? Amara's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked like she might run. But then she took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she spoke. Lydia is my mother, she said. And she's the reason James is dead. The words hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the world spinning out of control. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara hesitated, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. I'll tell you everything, she said finally. But not here. It's not safe. Meet me tonight, at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Come alone. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone. Before Eleanor could respond, Amara turned and ran, disappearing into the trees. Eleanor stood there, her mind racing. The old warehouse on 5th Street, it was a place James had mentioned once, a long time ago. He had said it was abandoned, a relic of the past. But why would Amara want to meet her there? And what was she so afraid of? Eleanor didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure: she had to go. She had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost her. As she drove home, Eleanor felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She didn't know what she would find at the warehouse, but she knew it would change everything. The truth was close, so close she could almost touch it. But so was the danger. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. But she had no choice. She had to know. She had to end this. For James. For Amara. For herself. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove toward the old warehouse on 5th Street. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a dim, eerie glow. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts: Amara's warning, Lydia's threats, and the haunting words from James's journal. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. The truth was too close, and the stakes were too high. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, crumbling structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Eleanor parked her car a block away, her heart pounding as she stepped out into the cool night air. She glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out at her, but the street was deserted. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and began walking toward the warehouse. As she approached the entrance, she noticed a faint light coming from inside. Her stomach churned. Amara had said to come alone, but what if it wasn't Amara waiting for her? What if it was Lydia? Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She thought about turning back, about calling Detective Harris for help. But then she remembered Amara's words: "Don't trust anyone." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warehouse was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. The light she had seen was coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. Eleanor's eyes scanned the space, searching for any sign of Amara. And then she saw her. Amara was standing in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and drawn. She looked terrified. "Amara," Eleanor whispered, rushing toward her. "What's going on? Why did you bring me here?" Amara shook her head, her eyes darting around the room. "I didn't bring you here," she said, her voice trembling. She did. Before Eleanor could ask who she meant, a voice echoed through the warehouse, cold, mocking, and all too familiar. "Hello, Eleanor." Eleanor spun around, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was a woman, tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes. She looked older than the photo Eleanor had seen, but there was no mistaking her. It was Lydia. She stepped forward, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "I knew you'd come. You're just like James, always chasing the truth, even when it's going to destroy you." Eleanor's mind raced. She glanced at Amara, who was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," Amara whispered. "I didn't want to do this, but she made me. She said she'd hurt you if I didn't." Eleanor's heart sank. Amara had led her here, but not by choice. Lydia had manipulated her, just like she had manipulated James. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" Lydia's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only malice. "What do I want?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I want what I've always wanted. Justice. James thought he could walk away from me, from his responsibilities, and start a new life with you. But he was wrong. He owed me. He owed us, she gestured to Amara, who flinched at the mention of her name. And when he refused to give me what I deserved, I made sure he paid the price. Eleanor felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. You killed him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lydia's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I didn't pull the trigger, if that's what you're asking, she said. But I made sure it happened. James thought he could outrun me, but he was wrong. And now, you're going to pay for his mistakes. Eleanor's mind raced. She needed to think, to find a way out of this. But Lydia was blocking the only exit, and Amara was too scared to move. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lydia tilted her head, as if considering the question. I haven't decided yet, she said. But I think it's only fair that you suffer the way I did. You took James from me, and now I'm going to take everything from you. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Lydia's smile faltered, and she turned toward the door, her expression darkening. What did you do? She demanded, her voice sharp. Eleanor shook her head, confused. I didn't, but before she could finish, the door burst open, and Detective Harris stepped inside, his gun drawn. Lydia Carter, he said, his voice firm. You're under arrest. Lydia's eyes widened in shock, but then she laughed, a cold, bitter sound that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. You think this is over, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Detective Harris didn't respond. He moved forward, his eyes never leaving Lydia as he handcuffed her. Eleanor watched in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process what was happening. As Lydia was led away, Detective Harris turned to Eleanor. Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle. Eleanor nodded, though she felt anything but okay. How did you know we were here? She asked. Detective Harris hesitated, then glanced at Amara. She called me, he said. She told me everything. I'm sorry it took so long to get here. Eleanor looked at Amara, who was still trembling, her face streaked with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Amara shook her head. I'm sorry, she said again. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know what else to do. Eleanor reached out, pulling her into a tight hug. It's okay, she said softly. You're safe now. But as she held Amara, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Lydia's words echoed in her mind, you have no idea what you're dealing with, what had she meant? And what else was she hiding? Eleanor didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure, the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And she wasn't going to stop until she found it. Eleanor stood in the dimly lit warehouse, her arms still wrapped around Amara, as Detective Harris led Lydia away. The sirens outside grew fainter, but the tension in the room didn't ease. Amara was shaking, her sobs quiet but relentless, and Eleanor held her tighter, trying to offer some comfort. It's over, Eleanor whispered, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. Lydia was in custody, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on her like a storm cloud refusing to break. Detective Harris returned a few minutes later, his expression grim. We've got her, he said, but there's something you need to see. He handed Eleanor a small, folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling. It was a note, written in Lydia's sharp, angular handwriting. Asterisk, you think you've won, but you don't know the whole story. Ask Amara about the night James died. She knows more than she's telling you. Asterisk. Eleanor's heart sank as she read the words. She looked up at Amara, who was staring at the note, her face pale. Amara, Eleanor said softly, what is she talking about? What happened that night? Amara's breath hitched, and she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. I didn't want to tell you, she said, her voice barely audible. I was scared. I thought if you knew, you'd hate me. Eleanor reached out, gently taking her hand. I could never hate you, she said. But I need to know the truth. Please. Amara took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. That night, the night James died. I was there, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to be. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to know why he left us, why he never came back. I followed him to the bridge. He was standing there, looking out at the water. I called out to him, and he turned around. He looked so sad. He told me he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt us. And then he stepped back. Too far. He lost his balance and, she choked on the words, unable to finish. Eleanor felt like the world had stopped. James hadn't been pushed. He hadn't been murdered. He had fallen. And Amara had been there, watching it happen. Why didn't you tell anyone? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Amara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I was scared. I thought they'd blame me. And then Lydia found out. She said if I told anyone, she'd make sure I paid for it. She's been controlling me ever since. Eleanor's heart ached for Amara. She had been carrying this burden alone, terrified and manipulated by the woman who was supposed to protect her. You're not to blame, Eleanor said firmly. None of this is your fault. Lydia is the one who's been hurting people, not you. Amara nodded, but the guilt in her eyes was still there, raw and unrelenting. Detective Harris stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. We'll need to take your statement, Amara, he said. But you're not in trouble. You're a victim in all of this, just like Eleanor. We're going to make sure Lydia pays for what she's done. Amara nodded again, though she still looked terrified. Eleanor squeezed her hand, trying to offer some reassurance. I'll be with you every step of the way, she promised. As they left the warehouse, Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The truth was out now, but it wasn't the clean resolution she had hoped for. James's death had been an accident, but the pain and manipulation that followed were anything but. Lydia had torn their lives apart, and it would take time to heal. But for the first time in months, Eleanor felt like she could breathe again. She had answers. She had closure. And she had Amara. But as they drove to the police station, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Lydia's note had been too calculated, too deliberate. She had wanted Eleanor to find out the truth about Amara, but why? What was she hiding? The questions gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside, focusing on Amara, who was sitting silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window. At the station, Amara gave her statement, her voice trembling but steady. Detective Harris listened carefully, his expression sympathetic. When she finished, he nodded. You've been incredibly brave, he said. We'll make sure Lydia can't hurt anyone ever again. Amara managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor stayed by her side, offering silent support. As they left the station, Eleanor's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, *, you're not done yet. *, her hands shook as she opened it. The message was short, just one sentence, *, check the safe deposit box. Key is in James's journal. *, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had forgotten about the journal, about the small key tucked between the pages. What was in the box? And who had sent the email? She turned to Amara, her mind racing. I need to make one more stop, she said. Amara looked at her, confused but trusting. Okay, she said softly. Eleanor drove to the bank, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The key was still in her purse, and she prayed it would fit. When they arrived, she handed the key to the bank manager, who led her to the safe deposit boxes. Her heart pounded as she opened the box and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was a stack of documents, bank statements, property deeds, and a handwritten letter from James. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Lydia has finally shown her true colors. I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. I never wanted to hurt you, but I had to protect you. Lydia is dangerous, and she'll stop at nothing to get what she wants. But there's something you need to know. Amara isn't just my daughter. She's yours too. Eleanor's vision blurred as she read the words. She looked up at Amara, who was standing beside her, her eyes wide with confusion. What is it? Amara asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor handed her the letter, her hands shaking. Amara read it slowly, her breath hitching as she reached the end. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. How is this possible? Eleanor's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the past. James had never told her about Amara because she wasn't just his daughter, she was theirs. A child from a relationship he had before they met, a child he had kept hidden to protect them both from Lydia. And now, after everything, they had found each other. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she pulled Amara into a tight hug. You're my daughter, she whispered, her voice breaking. And I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner. Amara clung to her, her sobs quiet but full of relief. For the first time in years, they both felt a sense of belonging, of family. But as they stood there, holding each other, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Lydia's words echoed in her mind, you're not done yet. What else was out there? What other secrets had James taken to his grave? The questions lingered, but for now, Eleanor pushed them aside. She had found Amara. She had found a piece of herself she didn't even know was missing. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. Eleanor and Amara stood in the bank, the weight of James's letter still heavy in their hands. The revelation that Amara was not just James's daughter but Eleanor's as well had left them both reeling. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with a mix of shock, relief, and the faint stirrings of hope. Eleanor finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. We have so much to talk about, she said, looking at Amara with tears in her eyes. But first, let's go home. Home. The word felt strange on Eleanor's tongue. For months, her house had felt empty, a shell of the life she had built with James. But now, with Amara by her side, it felt like it could become a home again. They drove back in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. When they arrived, Eleanor led Amara inside, the familiar surroundings feeling both comforting and foreign. She made tea, the simple act of boiling water and steeping leaves giving her something to focus on. They sat at the kitchen table, the steam from their cups curling into the air as they began to talk. Amara spoke first, her voice hesitant but determined. I didn't know, she said, her eyes fixed on the table. About you, about any of it. Lydia never told me. She always said James abandoned us, that he didn't care. But now, I don't know what to believe. Eleanor reached across the table, taking Amara's hand in hers. I didn't know either, she admitted. James never told me about you. But I think he was trying to protect us. From Lydia, from everything. He made mistakes, but he loved us. I know he did. As they talked, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. James had met Lydia years before he met Eleanor, and their relationship had been tumultuous from the start. When Amara was born, James had tried to make it work, but Lydia's possessiveness and anger had driven him away. He had left, hoping to start over, but Lydia had never let go. She had tracked him down, manipulated him, and when he refused to give in to her demands, she had turned her anger on Amara, using her as a pawn in her twisted game. James had kept Amara a secret from Eleanor, not out of deceit, but out of fear of what Lydia might do if she found out about his new life. "He should have told me," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I would have understood. I would have helped him." Amara nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I wish I had known sooner," she said. "I spent so much of my life thinking he didn't care about me. But now, I don't know. Maybe he did the best he could." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "He loved you," she said firmly. "And I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this alone. But you're not alone anymore. You have me. And we're going to figure this out together." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and Amara began to rebuild their lives. They spent hours talking, sharing stories about James, and slowly piecing together the fragments of their past. Eleanor learned about Amara's life, her struggles, her dreams, her fears. And Amara learned about Eleanor, about the love she had shared with James and the life they had built together. It wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, of sadness, of guilt. But there were also moments of laughter, of connection, of hope. They were finding their way, one step at a time. Detective Harris kept them updated on Lydia's case. She had been charged with multiple counts of harassment, stalking, and coercion, and it was clear she would be facing significant time in prison. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her attempts to manipulate the situation only made things worse. For the first time in years, Amara felt safe. And for the first time since James's death, Eleanor felt like she had a purpose, a reason to keep going. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Amara turned to Eleanor. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" she asked, her voice soft. Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I think he would," she said. "I think he'd be so proud of you. And I think he'd be happy that we found each other." Amara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think so too," she said. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor and Amara began to settle into a new rhythm. They started making plans for the future, plans that included each other. Amara decided to go back to school, something she had always wanted to do but had never had the chance. And Eleanor, inspired by Amara's courage, began to take steps toward healing herself. She joined a support group for people who had lost loved ones, and she started seeing a therapist to work through the grief and guilt she had been carrying for so long. There were still challenges, of course. The past didn't disappear overnight, and there were days when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. But they faced those challenges together, leaning on each other for support. And slowly, the wounds began to heal. One afternoon, Eleanor received a package in the mail. It was from the bank, containing the rest of the documents from James's safe deposit box. Among them was a letter addressed to Amara. Eleanor handed it to her, her heart pounding as Amara opened it. The letter was short, but the words were filled with love. Amara, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm so sorry I couldn't be there for you. But I want you to know that I love you, and I've always been proud of you. You're strong, and brave, and you have so much ahead of you. Take care of yourself, and know that I'll always be with you. Love, Dad. Amara read the letter twice, her tears falling freely. Eleanor wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. He loved you, she whispered. And he'll always be a part of us. Amara nodded, clutching the letter to her chest. I know, she said. And I'm going to make him proud.